Chapter 29, February 20th, 1943, Bolomaski Park. No matter how tired we had become, the night crawled on as endlessly as this road. Yet there hadn't been a single place safe enough to stop and rest. With no shelter and such deep snow, I worried that eventually we'd lean against a tree, promising ourselves not to sleep and never open our eyes again. Hoping it would keep us going, I turned on the radio, keeping the volume as low as possible, since it was after midnight. It played mostly popular German music, although the upbeat songs were interspersed with news breaks. The Germans claimed a major victory over the Americans in Tunisia. I vaguely knew where Tunisia was, and I didn't particularly care. Why couldn't they report any losses? Just one. During the next news break, we learned that a high-ranking Nazi named Joseph Kobel called for total war against the Allies. Esther looked over at me and frowned. What does he mean? What does he think has been happening for the past 2.5 years? I held her thoughts inside me for some time. If the Nazis had been holding back on their full power, then I couldn't imagine what total war would look like. That bothered me far more than I could ever let on, but it left my stomach in knots. As the first hints of dawn finally began to peek through the trees, a new announcement came over the radio. Amon Goeth has been assigned as commandant of the new labor camp now under construction in Krakow. My ears pricked up. I'd heard that name before, associated with other concentration camps in Poland. This man had been trained in death, trained in murder, and if he was being sent to this new camp, then he was one of their best. That was where my parents would undoubtedly be sent as soon as the camp was completed. I snapped off the radio, and we walked in silence until my thoughts were so flooded with images of my father and mother that I could hardly stand it any more. It was a relief when Esther said, "We missed Sabbath last night." "I was busy rescuing you last night." "I've never missed a Sabbath before. Never." "God will understand, Esther. He understands why we miss Sabbath and why I wear the crucifix. He understands the gun inside my bag, and if I have to use it again, then I hope he will understand that too. Because every single day, my first thought is how to keep us alive until I have the very same thought again the next day." She fell silent, then said, "We'll celebrate next week." "We might." I expected by then we'd be in Warsaw, possibly in a fight for our lives, with other resistance members. I hoped God would understand that too. What would your plan have been if there had been no war?" I asked. Esther shrugged. "I would have wanted to get married, perhaps in a few years. There was a boy who went to the same synagogue as me. He was handsome." A beat passed. "He was sent to Belzec. I'm sure he's gone by now." "You don't know that." She looked over at me, barely able to keep her eyes open, yet the sadness registered clearly in them. "I can't have hope for everyone, Chaya." If this was a chance to find out more about her past, then I had to ask. "Why do you have hope for? Who do you have hope for, then?" She looked away, tightening her lips. I added, "I hope to one day know for sure what happened to my brother. Even if it's terrible, I need to know his fate." She took that in with a quiet nod, but her thoughts had drifted away from me, until she said, "I had a brother too once." Had. Once? Are they all gone? I asked. "All your family?" "My brother fought in the Polish forces when the Germans attacked. And my parents," she drew in a tense breath, the Nazis murder us many times over. They take our ability to worship properly, a spiritual death. They separate our families, another death there. They kill our dignity, our will to live, and finally, They take our lives. The question isn't whether my family is gone. It's only a matter of how many deaths they've suffered so far. After the efforts she'd made to avoid discussing her family with me, she just revealed more than she might have intended. Sometime since the war began, Esther became separated from her family, but she did not know their fates, just as I did not know about my brother. I thought of my parents again, trying to picture them on their wood crates in that apartment, side by side. I wanted to have hope for them, I really did, but I thought of the way Esther described the many deaths of our people. I wondered if my parents had suffered too many of them for their hearts to continue beating. "What about you?" Esther asked. If there had been no war, what would you have done?" "I'd have tried to enroll in a university," I said. "There is so much about the world I want to understand. I would have liked to spend the rest of my life learning." "Maybe you still can, when this is over. What would you study?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came to mind. I wanted to answer, to tell her everything I could be if the world would only give me a chance. But for as hard as I thought, my mind remained empty. How could that be? I did have plans before the war, grand and ambitious plans, hopes and dreams that seemed too bold to be spoken aloud. And now I couldn't even think of a single specific subject I would want to study. Worse still, I knew why. It was because joining the resistance had required me to accept the likelihood of my death. Chances were that I wouldn't survive this war, which meant there was no point in making plans for the future, or even thinking about it. I spoke to Esther of hope for our loved ones, yet I didn't even have hope for myself. To cover my silence, she said, "Well, if I outlast the war, then—" "Shh!" I grabbed Esther's arm and pulled her close, certain that I heard a noise off in the woods to our right. "What is—" Then she heard it too. The crunch of snow and the fallen leaves beneath it. The crack of a branch against a body in motion. It was the very same sound as we had heard last night, except this time we didn't have the barn to hide in. We didn't have anywhere to hide. We were definitely not alone. "Keep walking," I whispered. "Don't look around. Just walk, like we have every right to be here." "Should we get out your gun?" she asked. "I won't brandish a weapon that I can't use." But the kitchen knife was in my coat pocket, and I wrapped my hand tightly around it. I didn't know why. The only way this knife would help me was if I had to fight someone up close, and whoever was in the woods would shoot us before I'd even see their faces. Nor was it just one person. Now that I was attuned to it, I felt the weight of many eyes on us. It was still too dark to see them. Were they hid in the undergrowth? However, Esther and I were out in the open, and plenty visible, plenty exposed. "It might be a deer," she offered. It wasn't a deer. The hairs on the back of my neck were raised as instinctive warning of an approaching threat. If it was German soldiers, then they'd been tracking us since our escape last night. What were they waiting for? Esther pressed at the back of my arm, pushing me to walk faster, but I couldn't do that. We couldn't let on as we knew we were being watched. That might prompt a confrontation sooner than I wanted it. I needed time to plan, to think of something, anything to do. The sound were moving closer. From the corner of my eye, a glint of metal reflected in the moonlight. A rifle barrel was aimed directly at us. "Stop where you are," a man's voice ordered. "Drop your bags or we'll shoot." We obeyed, though my legs were shaking so much that I didn't trust them to keep walking. I clasped Esther's good hand in mine, and was surprised at how hard she gripped my fingers. The rest of her body had gone rigid and her eyes were closed, but I intended to look. I wanted to see the face of the man who shouted that order. If he was going to shoot, I wanted him to remember me. Chapter 30, February 20th, 1943, Bolomowski Park. Seconds passed, and no one emerged from the woods. Esther and I both remained exactly where we were, though I hated feeling that the delay was only giving the people in the woods more time to position themselves so what would be an entirely one-sided fight. Finally, I'd had enough. "Show yourselves, cowards!" I shouted. Esther opened her eyes long enough to send me a scalding glare, but I ignored it. Whatever was about to happen wouldn't change whether I insulted them or fell on my knees to beg for mercy. And I had no plan to do that. "Wait, I know her," a voice called from the woods. "Don't shoot. That's Shia Lindner." Esther and I exchanged another look. A different one, this time. No one should know me up here. No one should really know me anywhere. But when a familiar face emerged from the woods, I let out a shriek of joy and surprise. Reuben? I hadn't seen him since the night at the cafe. 2 months ago. Had he really survived? He pulled me into a hug then. As we parted, his eyes settled on Esther. Somehow, he must not have recognized her before this. His mouth hung half open when he looked back at me. I'm sure this was the last person he would have expected to see within a kilometer of me. "You're alive too?" he asked Esther. "I had no idea. Either of you." Questions rushed through my mind, but then 3 other people emerged from the woods, 2 men and a woman. One man wore a Polish military uniform, but the other 2 were in thick winter overalls, belted at the waist, and with rifles slung over each shoulder. "Who are they?" Esther whispered. "It's all right," Reuben gestured back at them. "They're friends." The woman reached out, taking my hand in hers and pulling me closer. "And we're friends to you. My name is Mindla. You helped get me out of the Krakow ghetto. You saved my life." I remembered her now. We'd smuggled her out in a wagon built with a false floor that could fit 2 or 3 people between the 2 layers of wood. She was not as thin as before, and had a fire in her eyes that I never saw back in the ghetto. Slowly, at least a dozen more men and women joined us on the road. 1 or 2 were about my age, and some were much older, perhaps in their 40s. A couple of others were in military uniform, but everyone was armed. Reuben widened his arms with a goofy smile. "We always said we'd join the partisans one day." "Well, you made it here too." I was so relieved to be in friendly company, to see Reuben. I hardly knew how to respond. I only smiled back at him and gladly let him take my bag, and then Esther's to carry. "Let's get off the road," one man said, then turned to me. "We have some hot coffee back at camp and a warm place you can rest." "Is it safe?" Esther whispered. "Safer than out here," Reuben assured us. As we followed the others back into the woods, Reuben stayed close to my side. "Where were you going?" "Warsaw." He touched my eyes. "No, Shia, you must know what is happening there." I stared back at his widened eyes, and his mouth pressed into a tight frown. Maybe the conditions in Warsaw were worse than I'd heard. "I know the Germans tried to carry out a deportation a month ago, but the resistance fought them off," I said, "which means the Germans will return with a far greater show of force." "And what do you think they'll do when they return?" "We both know. The resistance will need much help as they can get." I nudged his arm and gave him a slight smile. "I'm sure they'd welcome the help of the partisans." "Their uprising will fail. Every ghetto skirmish does," said the uniformed man ahead of us. Based on his look and accent, he must be from the Polish army. Maybe he wouldn't care if hundreds more Jews were killed. "It's not our uprising or their uprising," I countered. "We must think of ourselves as an organization. If we join together, we'll be stronger. Mordecai Analytics has united all the resistance groups in Warsaw," Reuben said. "They're now known as ZOB. We're helping them acquire food and weapons as best we can, but fighting from within a ghetto is a position of weakness. Ultimately, the people there are trapped, backed into a corner." I shook my head. "If the partisans were to attack from behind when the Nazis moved into the ghetto, they'd be the ones trapped.